This is Wontok Baboya College, Certificate 3, and this is the unit on Exodus, BIB303, and this is lesson number 6. In this lesson, we're going to continue to do a little bit more information and look a little bit more closely at the third of the fourth section in the book of Exodus. You might remember multiple copies of the diagram through the book. There's one on, the most recent one is actually on page 40, where it talks about the initial stages of liberation, which is the actual exodus from Egypt. The second section is the journey, talking about the trip to Mount Sinai. The third part, which we're focusing on at the moment, is relationship building, which is, in the last lesson we looked at covenant. Now we're looking at other aspects of that relationship building, and the fourth section deals with the worship of the people that was implemented at that time. So let's have a look at the book. We should be at this particular page here. So it's page 47, the covenant ceremony. Now this particular lesson will cover a few things. There's two parts to the lesson. They're both fairly short, but they're actually quite different, so we're going to treat them differently. And there'll be a reading and writing task after each of the sections. So as we saw in the last lesson, God was building the Israelites together into a nation that belonged to him. And he'd been teaching them two ways, as we'd seen, teaching them to put their faith and trust in him, even when things seemed impossible, and giving them laws to live by. And when we come to this part in Exodus 24, which I'll get you to look at in a moment, God's been building a strong two-way relationship with the people. On God's side, he promised to protect the people and bless them, give them land. And already in the story, we've seen how God has protected them during the plagues, and actually through the Exodus, and also in day-to-day living in terms of food and water. On the people's side, they had to come to promise to trust God. Now, in the initial stage, and this is actually an indication of God's grace at work, the people had not yet made this formal commitment. As we'll see, there are a couple of places where they do say, yes, we'll do what God wants. But in the first two parts of the book of Exodus, people have not actually promised to trust and obey God. They've actually had to do it, but they haven't promised yet, so that we haven't got an agreement yet. And the process of agreement is one which is sealed with a ceremony. And for most human beings, actually sealing something with a ceremony is really important. So we see in Exodus 24, we see that God actually seals or ties up this relationship in a special ceremony. And this sacred agreement is called a covenant. It's strong. And we do tend to do ceremonies like that. As I record this, it's the week after Anzac Day. And even in 2020, when we weren't able to meet together to celebrate it, communities still managed to come up with a way to celebrate. It was quite powerful actually to see candles and naked flames across the valley and in front of a number of houses. Also with weddings, we celebrate a wedding with a big ceremony. Sometimes the ceremony becomes more than the promises or the service, but there it is, major events in life. Similarly with baptism, and in many traditional communities, when somebody becomes an adult, there is a process of initiation that you need to go through. And it's taken seriously and is a significant event. And so for this, we have the celebration of the forming of a people, an agreement between God and God's people. Why not have a ceremony? And this is what we're looking at in Exodus chapter 24. So what I encourage you to do now, pause the video, read Exodus 24, 1 to 11. And as you restart it, you'll notice that the heading in the Good News Bible is that the covenant is sealed. And there's some interesting things that we want to pick out. First thing is to notice that there are three groups of people. There's Moses, there's the leaders, and then there's the rest of the people. And God commands Moses and the leaders to go part way up the mountain, but only Moses at this stage could go close to God, to the really holy place on the top of the mountain. And the people were not allowed to go up the mountain at all. So we have this, Moses draws close to God. And Moses did a covenant ceremony between God and the people, and this is what happened. And these are the major points. So Moses repeated all God's laws to the people, and the people promised to obey God. So that's the 10 Commandments, the laws that Moses wrote down after he broke the first set, and a number of other laws about justice and fairness that we'll get to in the second part of this lesson. So Moses wrote them down. Moses built an altar at the boundary of the mountain and set up 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes. So the altar represented God, but it also represented the people. The young men offered animal sacrifices to God. They saved the blood, because all the way through the law of Moses, we'll see, and even from the beginnings of the book of Genesis, blood represents the life of the creature. So Moses took the blood and threw half of it on the altar. And we see in each covenant agreement in this period in history and in this region, a covenant agreement is made, and there's usually some animal divided up between the two of them. In the foundation story, you have Abraham divides an animal, fights off the birds. One half is for God, one half is for him. And that's the way the agreements were usually made. So in this case, half of the life of the animal goes onto the altar for God. Moses reads out God's laws, the people gain promise, and Moses threw the other half of the blood over the people. Now, I don't know about you, but yuck. But it is a way of symbolising, and not something we want to see and do today. But the thing, even though we might be going yuck, and this may be foreign to us in a number of ways, or people to my culture at least, this is the sort of practice that many of the peoples around them would have known as being something you did with a god. So God's actually taking them from things that they knew, and in this actually introducing them to something new. And in traditional culture, it's not, blood is not all that unheard of. Many ceremonies involve the use of blood for sticking on feathers and other decorations. Okay, back to the book. So Moses read out the laws. People chose to obey. Yeah, half of the blood's there. Moses said, "This is the blood that seals the covenant." So there's something really precious happens. In a wedding ceremony, traditional way in the West is to actually seal the promises and the ceremony with the giving of rings, or even with the kiss, at the key point of the ceremony. Other cultures will use a whole range of other things in a wedding ceremony. For instance, I did a Filipino wedding, traditional one, a number of years ago, and that was an interesting process. We actually had two practices, one for all the aunties to sort out how everything was going to work, and then there were about 5 or 6 sets of different gifts that were given to mark the ceremony. Really quite moving, but the essence of it was the same as any other traditional wedding ceremony, traditional Christian wedding ceremony. Now, if you have a look again at the passage of verse 3 and 7, there's a response by the people, where the people say, "We will do everything the Lord has said." But this is almost the same as what they say back in Exodus 19. verse 8, and in preparation for receiving the Ten Commandments, or before Moses went up first, received the Ten Commandments. So the words seem to connect the people, connect the two chapters. They're the first and the second halves of the story, with all the laws in between. But notice the difference. Before the ceremony, the leaders couldn't go close to God's powerful presence on the mountain. After the ceremony, as in verse 9, they can. Not everybody can, but at least the leaders can go close. So in doing this, they have actually sealed themselves, they've made the agreement, and one of the ways of demonstrating is, yes, they're able to approach God. Looking upwards, they saw a beautiful vision of God looking through a pavement of sapphire as blue as sky. And you might remember, there are a number of other visions in the Bible of the presence of God, where it's actually in Isaiah chapter 6 and even in Revelation, the presence of God seems to have this sense of something like sapphire, this really deep, rich blue. Why? I don't know, but that's the description. And it's interesting that they had a fellowship meal there in peace with God. So a key part of this new covenant is to celebrate together. And most major ceremonies, formally or informally, there's usually food involved. What I've tended to find is that in my own Western culture, they think they're quite generous with food, but I've discovered as I work with people from a number of other cultures, my culture doesn't understand the hospitality or the amount of food that does get shared at significant moments. One that always stood out for me was hearing a new preacher preach for the first time in Tongan, and pigs. Oh, and the feast was huge, and I could not possibly do justice to the amount of food that was put in front of me, but that was part of their cultural expectation. So the relationship is sealed with ceremony, and we know that later Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, in the cloud of God's presence on the mountain, and that God gives him the law on the stones. We'll talk about in a later lesson what happens about him breaking them and having to write them again. So Christians call this covenant with the Israelites the Old Covenant or the Old Testament, and we will come, as I've indicated, to this concept of covenant a number of times, this agreement. So the Old Covenant lasts until Jesus brings the New Covenant between God and all people. You're going to read more about the two covenants in Hebrews 8 and 9. And as Jesus says, this is and of course there is blood with the new covenant, and the blood is not the blood of any pure animal, young animal. The blood that seals the new covenant is actually the blood of Christ himself. So Jesus said, this blood is poured out for many, and my blood seals God's covenant, Mark 14. So just as the elders of Israel had a fellowship meal with God, Jesus gave his followers a pattern for a fellowship meal, or for communion, or for Eucharist or Mass, whichever word you use in your tradition, in your church. Okay, what I'm going to suggest you do is have a look at I'm going to describe these three questions, and I'm going to suggest you pause the video, and then we'll come back in the second half and have a look at some of the individual laws. So what you need to do is describe what happens at the covenant ceremony, which sealed the covenant between God and the people. So there's your Bible reference, those verses. Make sure you explain the symbols used in the ceremony. Okay, so there are a couple of symbols that are used. Why are they used? Expecting I may need to talk to a few of you about that. So have a look at that, and what do you think it means? Who are God's covenant people today? That should be an easy one. And then, how would you explain covenant relationship to somebody in your community? Now we've left this part of the page blank. You can write down notes if you like using words. If you can think of a diagram or draw it, by all means do that. We want to allow that as a valid option because some people do think visually. And knowing that there are some artists in the class, really want to encourage you to do that. And with any of the other ones, if you can think of a way to answer it using a piece of artwork, by all means do that and include an extra sheet of paper in your book. Okay, pause the video now and answer those questions. Okay, you've done that. Let's start with continue on with the rest of the lesson. Another part of relationship building has been setting up a number of other laws. We've already talked about the 10 Commandments in the last lesson, and those are the foundation laws for the Israelite nation. But they had a lot more about how to live together. And we can see that, even during 2020, we've actually had to have new laws instituted to control people's behaviour, to actually stop people making other people sick. And you think, oh yeah, you just tell somebody and they should do it. But we've seen multiple instances of people breaking those rules and putting themselves and other people in danger. The worst part has been people have actually led to other people being sick and not even realising about it, that they've actually done it. Look at an idea of some of these laws and why they had them, and we do need to talk them through because a couple of situations they describe are just bizarre in terms of the way we think about things, because we don't have that sort of condition today. But this will help you understand. It's interesting as we go back, the chapter that comes after the giving of the 10 Commandments in chapter 20, the very next chapter after that's all explained to them is this chapter 21, which talks about how they should live together. There's an initial law after the 10 Commandments about construction of altars. And it's again spelling, and that one spells out not to make any idols or representations of God. But pause and read these first 11 verses of chapter 21. Okay, that's weird, isn't it? Slavery? Why is slavery the first thing that they deal with? Well, remember, what were they up until they reached Mount Sinai, before they crossed the Red Sea? They were the slaves or the labourers who worked for other people without any say. Now, it's different from how people work today because they were under the control of their master for many years. Now, this law sets some limits. So in Egypt, when they were slaves, they had to work for their masters. So in Egypt, they were under the control of their masters forever. And their masters, in fact, Pharaoh had command of life and death over them, would beat them to death, and order the execution of their children. What these laws do is they say 6 years no more. The laws about slaves were there to make sure that they would never get back into the situation they were in before in Egypt. But there's another thing which is quite different about the institution of slavery then to what we know about, say, in pre-Civil War America, or even in contemporary slavery in various places around the world. What they were doing here was actually setting up a system of labour where people did not have absolute ownership of another human being. Now, pre-Civil War America, Many of the slaves were slaves for life. The colour of your skin dictated whether you're a slave or not in certain US states. That also happens in certain places where people are forced into slavery, working in plantations, or in sexual slavery, as happens in a number of countries around the world today. So what they were looking at is actually making sure that workers were treated well. It was also saying that people could not be kept as slaves for their whole life against their will, and there's a couple of rules for that. Now, back in days when at this stage there's no government to actually provide Centrelink payments or anything like that, and somebody's last resort might be to sell themselves into slavery to support themselves or their family, but you couldn't do that forever. Lots of rules, and there's fairness involved in this. You couldn't separate a married couple. Female slaves had to be looked after and not taken advantage of. Now, today, and certainly in the post-Christian era, we don't see slavery as acceptable. It's interesting that it's cropped up a number of times historically, and probably the three that come to mind would be the slavery that was happening at the time of Jesus, which is very similar to the Egyptian form. And it's interesting that some of the rich people who became Christians in the Roman Empire, one of the things they actually did was actually realise it was not correct to keep slaves and actually freed them. We have a story of Philemon in the New Testament, just one letter of a runaway slave who should have been executed. And Paul argues that this man by the name of Onesimus, who'd become a Christian with him in jail, that his owner, Philemon, should actually be lenient on him. And church tradition has it that Onesimus actually became a bishop later on. So that's happened. And the church has always stood against slavery, and even in the lead up to the colonisation of America, the church opposed the re-establishment of slavery in the late Middle Ages. Human greed took over, and thankfully that fight against slavery ended in the late 18th century, late 1700s. And by the time colonisers come to Australia, they weren't actually doing it, even though those of us who live in North Queensland are well aware that the blackbirding trade that went on was in slavery in all but name. And the third wave has been this one of people today, and probably more slaves kept in plantations or sweatshop conditions in factories and in sexual slavery than has ever been any other time in history. So it's still an issue, but it's what we would see as being not acceptable in any way, shape or form. And in fact, the gospel tells us to God there is no difference between somebody who's a slave and somebody who's free. They are all loved by God. They all have value before God. So, but it is good to see the Israelite masters had to look after and protect the slaves. Yes, you're a new nation. You're not going to become Egyptians. Not allowed. So this is one of those ones which isn't very much like what anybody here in Australia in traditional societies have experienced. But a lot of the other laws that are talked about are very similar to traditional law and custom. So many Aboriginal, many Islander laws have some similarities. So there's a list of serious crimes. So, things like, and these were things which could incur the death penalty. Murder, hitting a parent, kidnapping, and even cursing a father or a mother. So we get those examples. And these are the laws about respecting other people. If you kill somebody, you're not respecting them. Yeah, these other ones, if you're doing that, you're not respecting other people. So we know in traditional law and custom tell us that we need to respect other people, especially elders. And if people do the wrong thing, there would be some form of discipline, or would be some form of education and ceremony, or you'd have to make some compensation to the other person. There's also laws about other crimes, and these are the ones which don't lead to a death penalty. So this is one of the amazing laws in the Old Testament which really stands out. If somebody hurts somebody else in a fight, you had to pay for the time they were actually off work. Make sure that they wouldn't starve. If a woman got hurt and she lost the baby inside her, then the person that hurt her had to pay up. So there would be a punishment. If one person hurt another, the person who did it had the same hurt done to them. So that's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So if somebody's hurt, the same damage is done to them, which is interesting. But this law actually limits what is done. So if somebody's only bruised or hurt, the other person can only be bruised or hurt. And it's somewhat different to what happens in some cultures around the world where somebody is hurt, and when people are not living according to law and custom, and we do see that in some communities today where young fellas aren't doing that, where things get out of hand, is somebody gives you an insult, you hit them. And because you've hit one of them, they get their brothers and their cousins together and they come around and they beat the living putty out of you, which means then your brothers and cousins get together and there's a full-blown riot going on. It really gets out of control. Now, we know there are some communities where that happens, and it's been interesting talking to one or two elders that that's actually not the way traditional dispute resolution actually happens. And we need to get back to the old ways. And I think there's a certain degree of wisdom in that, even in my own culture, that, often if somebody ends up getting thrown in jail and the person has been hurt has not been looked after. So, what they do, what God does, is says you're not allowed to get involved in payback. Don't let it get out of control. Don't let it be like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, or Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck, where it starts with insults and then gets to guns, or bows and arrows, then guns, then cannon, then missiles. Yeah, don't let it go that way. Make the response match the original offence. And of course, we're reminded that Jesus taught a better way. And you can go, and I encourage you to pause and read that in Matthew 5. What is it? Not eye for an eye, but the way of love. Turn the other cheek. Okay, if someone's careless and the person gets hurt accidentally, then again, like this other one, there's compensation for the person who's being hurt. And it's interesting that in Australian government law, a number of these ideas from the book of Exodus, and as I detail a little bit later in Genesis, still are part of the law of the land. And I've heard lawyers actually say that, when they talk about the city events of the Bible, actually saying this is, these things actually feed into our understanding of law in European culture. So that's laws. We dealt with laws about serious crime, about other crimes, and then about looking out after others. So there's laws about caring for the poor and the oppressed. So widows and orphans, people who are most vulnerable in society, they shouldn't be oppressed, shouldn't be standing over them, shouldn't be cheating them when they loan money to them. So God cares about poor people. So his people need to do the same. again, it's this thing, in Egypt, they were treated very badly. They're not to become Egyptians in their behaviour. Similarly, Israelites had laws about caring for strangers and enemies. The Egyptians treated them as strangers and enemies and treated them very badly. One of the things that I struggle with in Australia at the moment is anybody who's a stranger or a foreigner, there's a tendency in Australian politics at the moment to treat them badly. And this is not a Christian way of doing things. How do we respect them? And particularly in one community I was in, we actually had a school, and the school, which was a couple of blocks down the road from my church, had an indigenous name named Milperos, which in the local language was meeting place. And the school just taught English and mathematics to mainly new arrivals in Australia. And at any given time, the school could have up to about 300 people, 300 young people in it. And many of those, sometimes over half to 2/3 of them, were refugee children who'd never had the opportunity to learn to read or write wherever they come from. And in many cases have come to Australia having experienced horrendous nightmare conditions. And talking to one of my neighbours when we were living there, and she was volunteering for the reading program, and she said, you just don't. They actually had counsellors employed to deal with some of the trauma, and she said she saw one young fellow with a 2-inch wide scar that started beside his neck and ran all the way, and she noticed the rest of the scar popping out underneath between his shirt and his pants one day, and it's quite obvious what had happened. Somebody actually taken this young lad with a machete and tried to cut him in half, and he somehow survived. That's the sort of stuff I'm talking about. Those are the people who need to be treated with kindness and care. And it was just a privilege to actually hear the students share and see them go on to become part of the Australian community, and particularly seeing some of those people go on. It was also one of the most, the teachers of that school were the happiest teachers I think I've ever met in my life. So with strangers and enemies, and to respect what belonged to them, remembering they knew what it was like to be oppressed, so they shouldn't do it to others. And and God's quite blunt about that. And even when Jesus tells a couple of parables, there's one where he has the rich steward, he's showing grace and he immediately walks out, picks on somebody else, and the king throws him in jail. It's quite obvious. If you've been shown something good, God expects good from us. So they were given laws about caring for the land. Remember that these people coming into the promised land, even though Abraham, their forefathers were farmers, these people had lost that while they were slaves. So they needed to be reminded that if you're farming, you need to let the land rest just as people need to rest. And they have laws about caring for animals and workers. So there's this sort of thing which shouldn't be that unfamiliar to many Indigenous people, was it echoes quite strongly with traditional law and custom. I encourage you now to have a look at Exodus 23. So we're going through a couple of chapters here. Exodus 23, just look at 14 to 17. And this picks up 3 of the festivals, so the ceremonies. Now, later on, there'll be a couple of other ceremonies added to this, so that they would have these 3 festivals. So if you've had a look at it, there's the festival of unleavened bread, which flows into the Passover ceremony. So, in this case, it's a long ceremony running for let me double check it. I was looking at it now, I've forgotten it. A week-long celebration. And then a little bit later on, there's a harvest festival. And, usually about 7 weeks after, about 50 days, reminded to give thanks to God for the food that they could grow. And because it was this time after, in Greek, that got named Pentecost. Okay, so Passover, giving thanks for food, and then later on, festival shelters, or in the old King James Version, I think you'll see booths. It just means, set up a tent. You camp either in the house or outside, and Jewish people do still follow that today. And that happened to coincide with the gathering of fruit from vines and fruit trees. It's also known as the Festival of Tabernacles. It reminded them as a people of the time they lived in the desert. So I thought what I would do is give you a bit of a feel, but sometimes it's really hard to get a sense of this. Here we go. So this is pretty blurry, but I was trying to find a way to actually give you a feel for when these things happened. So we have a calendar goes around. So in the middle, we have our calendar: January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. And around the outside, we have the Jewish calendar, the 12 months of the Jewish calendar. And you'll notice that it does not match ours. So the first month is the month of Nisan. And that or about the time this was drawn, currently begins around mid-March. So the feast of the Passover is usually around the end of March or April. It does move a bit because this is a lunar calendar. So in our calendar, every 4 years we put an extra day in. Every few years in the Jewish calendar, well, a bit longer than that, they put in an extra month to try and bring it back. And so the Feast of Passover, which coincides with Christian Easter, tends to move around our calendar a bit, but it's on that particular date. So Passover's here. The Feast of Weeks, or they call it here the Festival of the Harvest, Pentecost occurs here, so that's nearly 2 months later. And then the Feast of Shelters, or Tabernacles, or Booths, happens 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So half a year later. Now, you'll notice there's a few other ones here, and these are ones that have actually come in a little bit later on in the history of the Israelite people. Now, remembering that Exodus comes from very early in their history, we have 1, 2, 3. But the other ones that get picked up, and part of this feast is this Day of Atonement, and Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, comes in a little bit later on, which has a slightly different history, which we won't get into, and the Feast of Purim, which celebrates where they remember the salvation of the people during the time of Queen Esther. And we see that in Jewish cultures today, in Jewish tradition, but you won't find much reference to it. You won't find any reference to it in the Bible, but it is certainly a solid practice that was in place. And Hanukkah, because it's early December, that often when you see people talk about happy holidays, and trying not to offend anybody, and in the process of offending everybody, that is a Jewish festival that happens to coincide fairly closely with Christmas for Christians. So in some communities where there's a big Jewish population, you'll often see those things happening around the same time. So I hope that's been useful to give you a bit of a feel for the major celebrations and holidays. There's a special reminder in Exodus 23. And I'm just trying to remember the so promises and instructions. And it's about them being led. He promises again to make them his people and to give them land to live in. But they had to worship him, trust him, and obey him. And worship amongst the people is the focus of the next lesson. You know, the reminder that they've got a special relationship with God, that God would protect and bless them. So they had to live God's way in response. That way, they couldn't belong to God and disobey. If you disobeyed, you'd lose your land and you lose this close relationship with God. So that picture there, which I think I might make a bit bigger for future reference, you know, there's a typical altar of the time before this time here. Okay, we're reaching the end of the lesson, and just let's have a look quickly at these questions, and I'll invite you to, I'll end the video and let you finish this off in preparation for starting lesson 7. Now, there's some people who think that laws are bad because they stop them doing what they want to do. So what should Christians think about law? And there's a couple of Bible references there to look at, and it gives us a balance. You know, what you're looking for is a balance between what's right, just, and what is unjust or wrong laws. And just write down a few notes there about what you think about how Christians should think about law. The second one, which is an assessment task, the Israelites had laws especially to protect the poor and the weak. But sometimes there are laws which protect the rich and powerful rather than the poor and the weak. Now, this is another one where you need to grow confidence in expressing your opinion. One of the things we expect leaders to be is people who can actually say what they think. And maybe your opinion's good, maybe it's bad, but you need to have confidence in being able to share it. So what we want you to do is talk or write about what you see happening in Australia today or in the world today. The laws in the Bible are meant to protect the poor and the weak. Do the laws of our country protect rich and powerful rather than poor people? What do you think? And then, how does God feel about unjust laws? If you have a look at this passage from Amos, that'll give you a fairly clear idea, and you put that in your own words. Okay, so I'm about to end the video, and that's what you need to do in terms of answering that second thing. So we've seen some of the ceremony about the covenant and how the laws were written for them to live in community. Now, when you get into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, that's done in a lot more detail, and a lot more circumstances are obviously thought about over a bigger length of time. Some of the laws are really strange, and we wonder why they're written. And a lot of it's got to do with what was happening in the culture of their time and what was considered to be usual amongst the peoples who, in region where they lived, people in the Promised Land, and for what they experienced in Egypt. Thank you.